Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this will be the first in a 6-part class series on the Sephiroth. I've titled this series Garments of the Infinite, and before too long, you'll see why, if you don't already know why I've used that title. So we'll, again, like I was just saying before I started the recording, this is kind of a follow-up in many ways to the previous class series. So for example, if you're listening to this as a recording later on, I do recommend, or, especially if it is much later on, I do recommend that you listen to the class Paths, Letters, and Correspondences series first, as I think that'll be helpful to do them in that order. But if you're just joining us live or you haven't, I think everything will be fine. I just think it makes a little more conceptual sense to start with the other class series first. But yeah, let's just jump right into it. So I just wanted to open it. I found this nice Eliphas Levi quote. I was reminded of this nice Eliphas Levi quote, so I just want to open with that. This is from Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. So Levi says, "On penetrating into the sanctuary of the Kabbalah, one is seized with admiration at the sight of a doctrine so logical, so simple, and at the same time so absolute. The essential union of ideas and signs, the consecration of the most fundamental realities by primitive characters, the trinity of words, letters, and numbers, a philosophy simple as the alphabet, profound and infinite as the word, theorems more complete and luminous than those of Pythagoras, a theology which may be summed up on the fingers, an infinite which can be held in the hollow of an infant's hand, 10 figures and 22 letters, a triangle, a square, and a circle. These are the entire elements of the Kabbalah. These are the component principles of the written word, reflection of that spoken word which created the world." So yeah, I think it's just sort of a nice quote in general, but I especially liked a couple of things here. Obviously we're going to be talking about the 10 figures here that he's talking about, or the 10 Sephiroth that we'll be occupying ourselves with for the coming 3 months. But I think the kind of unity of complexity or profundity and vastness with simplicity is one of the things that I found really powerful about the Kabbalah. A theology which can be summed up on the fingers, right? I mean, it's no coincidence that we have 10 fingers and that there are 10 Sephiroth. And so while it is the most profound and sort of highest, spiritual and theological and philosophical doctrines, it's also, as simple as counting on your fingers. It's an infinity which can be held in the hollow of an infant's hand. So I just like that sense of the unity between something so basic and primitive and fundamental and something so exalted and profound. So hopefully we can try to capture a little of that spirit in the course of this class, of keeping things like simple and basic. And in the way I've tried to arrange the class, I've tried to do that. So we'll start with kind of a simple structure, and then each week as we go through, we'll build more and more and compile layers after layers on top of each other, and look at different ways of configuring things and put the things into action, so that over the course of these 6 weeks, we'll slowly build up a sense of how these very, very simple, basic things interact and what they mean and how they can be used. Okay, so conceptually here, we start from nothing or from the infinite. So the Hebrew you see there on the screen says Ein Sof. Ein means nothing, Aleph, Yod, Nun. That's the word on the right. Here, of course, is read right to left. So that means nothing or not. Sometimes that by itself is used as a name for the absolute divinity, which is not nothing in the sense of not real or non-existent, but nothing in the sense of beyond anything that humans can conceive of, beyond the difference between being and nothingness, beyond anything we can imagine or hold in our minds. It's absolutely transcendent. And then the second word there you see, Sof, means sort of limit. So Ein Sof is without limit, without limit or infinite. And so this is a name that's used very commonly by the Kabbalists. As we'll see later on, the different forms of the negative get kind of put into a trinity, but we'll talk about that much later. But for now, just know that the Ein Sof is, or Ein Sof, is the infinite. It is the name for the absolute divine reality. And in Jewish Kabbalistic terms, this is God. This is the Godhead itself. And so in Jewish mysticism, as their conception of God becomes higher and higher and more transcendent, it very much becomes like the God of negative theology, the God of whom, anything that you can say about this God is false, right? He had no qualities, no parts, no attributes, nothing that the human mind can grasp onto in any sort of way. And yet the Jewish God is also a God who's very much involved in human history, right? I mean, he chooses, Israel as his chosen people. He's giving laws, he's coming down, he's interacting with the different prophets and leaders. And so there's a bit of a question about how, both of these things can be the case. How can God be involved with humanity? And even just in creating the world, not just like speaking to people and giving laws. But how can God create? How can God be involved with human history and human reality? And at the same time be absolutely ineffable and transcendental? And so that's what we'll be looking at today is a little bit about how some of the conceptual structures that get put in place to talk about relating the infinite divinity to the human world. I also want to say, kind of along this idea of beginning with nothing or starting from nothing, that I assume most of you here are already at least somewhat familiar with the ideas of the Sephiroth, but it might be helpful, or at least interesting, to maybe set aside some of what you know about those things and to kind of try to get a fresh look at some of these things. I think some of the Kabbalistic terms can very easily become sort of technical terms, and we forget what those words actually mean and signify. Another thing too is that the tree of life, which I'm going to present as one particular arrangement of the Sephiroth, not as something that's absolutely inherent to them. And so we won't look at the tree of life until the third class in this series. So in this class and the next class, there's no tree of life. So I want to start with the Sephiroth, sort of minus all that idea, and then we'll come to that later as a particular way of organizing them and arranging them. But so maybe you two could kind of start with nothing, start from a sense of not understanding or not knowing what the Sephiroth are, as a way of being open into new perspectives, if they are something that you're already familiar with. If you're not familiar with them, then great, you are starting from there. Let's see. So again, we have this idea of clothing the infinite. Or of having some sort of account of how, the infinite reality creates the world and how it interacts with individual humans. Let's see. So these various, it's a sort of tricky thing. I don't want to get too far into historical concerns and things like that, because we have a lot of material to get through. But essentially what happens is that the Kabbalists start talking about a series of like either emanations of the divine, and we'll talk more about kind of philosophically what emanation means, but somehow the Ein Sof, the infinite, it creates, or it sort of radiates from itself a series of increasingly sort of less high concepts. And again, this is conceived of as in a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of debate about whether or not these things are emanations in the true Platonic sense of the word emanation. And again, we'll talk about Platonism and things next week, which will help to fill a lot of this in. Some see these things as like attributes of divinity itself, as a process that occurs within the divinity. Some see them as created sort of just outside of the divinity. So there's different ways of thinking about them, and there's no need for us, I think, to settle into just one particular way of thinking about it. This is something that we can keep kind of as an open question as we go through of what exactly these things are. One way of thinking about them maybe is if you are familiar with the idea of the aeons in Gnosticism, which aeons don't mean like periods of time, they mean like emanations from the Godhead. So in the beginning, you'll have the one, or sometimes it's almost called the alien God in Gnosticism sometimes, the absolute divinity. And then that divinity sort of gives rise to a series of increasingly separate, sort of increasingly far from the perfect unity, a series of kind of beings. Sometimes they're personified, sometimes they're more abstract as like qualities. And then eventually, usually the last one, which is often named Sophia, she then is through, the Gnostics tend to see this as some kind of like a cosmic accident, where the Kabbalists absolutely do not. The Kabbalists, like the Neoplatonists, see physical reality as a necessary part of creation, even if it's like the most distant from the divine. It's still necessary. It's not like an accident like the Gnostics see it. But anyways, the idea that the final emanation, Sophia, she gives rise to the powers that then create the world. So these sort of powers, these emanations, they're all before anything else is created. And so we'll see as we go through the idea that sometimes the Sephiroth are more like that. They're more like a series of emanations that happen between the absolute divinity itself and when that divinity begins the process of creation. And then sometimes they are on a much more kind of universal scale, where the Sephiroth are like a tenfold division of everything that exists, and everything that is or ever could be can all be mapped out to the Sephiroth. Everything from the most sort of base material to the highest divinity is all comprehended by the Sephiroth. So that's something we should be aware of, is these kind of two different ways the Sephiroth can be talked about. And we're talking about the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, which we'll be mostly focused on today. It's largely the first. So these things are, so emanations of the divinity, but they're before the process of creation really gets started. You can almost think of them as like a sort of an apparatus or a machine or something like that, that the infinite creates in order to be able to start the process of creation, and then in order to be able to sort of relate to the creation. Later on, when we talk about the concept of the four worlds, that'll be a few classes from now, we'll be able to get some kind of technical vocabulary that will be able to make this distinction really, between these kind of two ways of talking about the Sephiroth, we'll be able to make this distinction really, really clear and precise. But for now, just know that the basic way that the two things are related is that the Sephiroth in their sort of absolute forms as like attributes of the divinity, those things are reflected into the creation on various levels. And so it's almost just a semantic question of whether we're calling the Sephiroth the pure essences in themselves, or whether we're calling the Sephiroth anything that participates in that pattern. Okay. So I just want to read you a little passage here this is from Gershom Scholem's book, The Kabbalah, about the idea of, I've already been using the word Sephiroth, but about the idea of these different like levels or things that emanate from the Ein Sof. Because Sephiroth, they're not called Sephiroth right from the beginning. There's different terms that are used. Let's see. I bookmarked the wrong page here. Let's see. So Scholem says, the term Sephiroth as early as the Sepher Bahir, which is a text we'll look at a little bit today. It is related to the Hebrew word sapphire, which means sapphire. For it is the radiance of God, which is like that of the sapphire. The term is not used at all, the term meaning Sephiroth, is not used at all in the main part of the Zohar, appearing only in the later stratum, but other Kabbalists too employed a wealth of synonyms. The Sephiroth are also called Ma'aramot and Dibarim, sayings, Shemot, names, Orot, lights, Kohot, powers, Keterim, crowns, since they are the celestial crowns of the Holy King, Midot, in the sense of qualities, Madrigadot, stages, Levushim, garments, and that's where I got the name for this class series, the idea of the garments as something that clothe the infinite and allow us, something that we can't see. If it had clothes on it, we would be able to perceive, some of its, sort of where it is, how big it is and things like that, right, by clothing it with something. So the Sephiroth are like the garments of the infinite. Let's see what else. Marot, mirrors, netiot, shoots, Mekorot, sources, Yamim, Elyonim, supernal or primordial days, Sitarin, aspects, and then lots of others, meaning the interface of God, the limbs of the king gets used, and lots of other terms as well. All right, but we'll be talking about them as the Sephiroth, but I just wanted to give you some kind of flavor, and a sense too that these aren't the only things that these things are called. These aren't the only names that these things are called. But we'll be talking about them as the Sephiroth. So there you've got it in the singular, and so at the top we see Sephirah in the singular. So that's, again, Hebrew is read right to left, so that's Samek, Pei, Yod, Resh, He. This word is feminine singular, and it most literally means counting. But it's a noun, like not an activity of counting, but like a counting. And then the plural is Sephiroth, where the hey at the end gets dropped off and is replaced with vav tav to make the plural ending. So this is a feminine plural word, Sephiroth, which means countings. So we have 1 Sephirah, 2 Sephiroth, up to 10 Sephiroth. So for now, we'll mostly just use them as like technical terms. And we'll see later on the way that these words get kind of elaborated and Kabbalistically interpreted. The thing I think just to notice for now is that the root of these words is samek pe resh. The yod being added is just a different form of the word, and then different endings. But samek pe resh is the root of this word, and we'll see that again. All right, so now the entire Jewish Kabbalah, develops. Well, there's probably some kind of influence coming like out of the Greek tradition. And so there probably is awareness of like the Pythagorean ideas about like a set of 10 things that extend from the absolute down to creation. So there's some kind of model or basis for this. At least conceptually, these things are derived from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible, the sacred scriptures, which are, especially in the Kabbalah, not just like the laws and teachings that God gave to man, but actually the plan of the creation, the primordial pattern of everything. And so because of its divinely inspired nature and because it's the plan of everything, there's a kind of like unlimited or nearly unlimited amount of like depth, like interpretive depth. And so the Kabbalists, for generations after generations after thousands of years, study these texts and pull out all kinds of patterns and concepts using all kinds of Kabbalistic techniques. So one of the main sources of the 10 Sephiroth is 10 specific verses within the first chapter of Genesis. And these are all the 10 things that God says. Now, actually, God only says 9 things here. The first one there, it doesn't actually say that he says it, but the way it gets interpreted is that there's an implied saying. And then there's a kind of, lots of kind of doctrine about why it doesn't say that he says it and it's only implied and so on. But number one there is an implied speech of God. So we'll just read through them real quick. So, and don't worry too much about the direct correspondences of these verses to the Sephiroth. It's more just the idea of like the 10 sayings. All right, so in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. 2, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the idea was that he said something similar, like let there be a heaven and earth or something like that. That's taken to be implied from the first verse of Genesis there. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. 3, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. 4, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. 5, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And this one corresponds nicely. The lights that we're talking about here, of course, are like the luminaries, the sun and the moon. And as we'll see later, the 6th Sephirah does correspond with the sun in our system. All right, 7, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. 8, and God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind, and it was so. 9, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. This is another interesting too. The Sephirah 9 is often particularly associated with humanity and humanity's powers, especially in our tradition. 10, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So again, don't worry too much about specific correspondences, although I pointed out too, there are some other interesting kind of suggestive parallels. But again, the idea that these are like the 10 powers through which God creates things, where these are like the speech of God. these 10 things. All right, and then the specific names of the Sephiroth are derived from a number of verses, and that sort of mutates over time. The final name we get, the final list of names that we have, don't end up corresponding exactly to any particular biblical verse. And there's more than just these two that I've got here on the screen, but these will at least give you a flavor of where this stuff is coming from. All right, so from Exodus chapter 31, we have, "And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, See, I have called by name Bezaleel." Bezaleel in Hebrew text is usually given as Betzalel rather than Bezaleel. This is the King James. Betzalel is the primary artisan who makes the tabernacle in the wilderness. So that is a really important symbolic thing. So I've called by name Bezaleel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, and of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship. So the Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim, this will correspond to the first Sephiroth. The next word here, wisdom, is Chokmah, which will correspond to the second Sephiroth. Understanding is Binah, and that'll correspond to the third Sephiroth. And then knowledge is Da'ath, which will correspond to something that's sometimes treated as a Sephiroth and sometimes not. And we'll come back to that idea. All right, and then in 1 Chronicles, chapter 29, we read, "Thine, O Lord, is the..." Oh, and actually, that sort of group of things, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, there's a handful of verses where that grouping is specifically used. But this one is extra important because it also includes the idea of the Spirit of God, which is, again, Ruach Elohim, which can also be translated as breath of God, which corresponds to the first Sephiroth. All right, and then in 1 Chronicles, we read, "Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heaven, and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord, and thou art exalted as head above all." So this is where we get, again, not in the exact form, but this is the basic source of the next 7 Sephiroth after the first 3 that we just saw. All right, so again, I said we're not going to look at the tree of life. So instead, to map these things out, I've used another kind of traditional Kabbalistic way. I created this image myself, but it's based on some traditional Kabbalistic diagrams. And so these show the idea, the kind of outer white space is either the absolute itself or is the space that the absolute creates in order for the creation to happen. Which is an idea, if we have time, we'll come back to that idea at the end of the class, maybe. All right, and then you see descending in order. We have the Sephiroth in descending order, from the first Sephiroth, the crown, to the second, wisdom, third, understanding, and then mercy, strength, beauty, victory, splendor, foundation, and kingdom. Oh, actually, I had a zoomed-in version here. Right, so here are our 10 emanations, and one way of looking at the way that these emanations can be sort of visualized or pictured as going from the outside where the infinite is, and then sort of increasingly zooming into into the creation. All right, so we'll just take them one by one. Now we've already talked about the infinite, the Ein Sof. So now the next 10 from crown down to kingdom. We'll just look at these one at a time. All right, so now in each one of these, the big Hebrew word in the middle, that's the name of the Sephiroth in Hebrew. And then around the ring, I've just got a few different divine names and divine powers, the name of the angel and archangel that are associated with that Sephiroth. That's something we'll come back to later. But for now, we'll just look at the names of the Sephiroth. So this is Kether, right? So that's Kaf, Tav, Resh that you see in the middle. That's Kether, and it means crown. I'm not going to say, I'll show you some excerpts and things like that from a few different texts, but I'm not going to do too much interpretation here. I really want you to just sort of start the process of thinking about what these things mean. So you think about, the idea of crowns and what it means for something to be a crown. And, a crown obviously sits on someone's head. Whose head? Well, a king's head or a queen's head, generally, right? So we can start to think of some of these ideas, what is a crown? What does a crown mean? What does a crown signify? And I think that your kind of meditation on these things and investigation of them will be much more useful than anything I can say. but I will show you some passages from some Kabbalistic texts. All right, so this is from the Sepher Bahir, or Sepher Bahir, which is a Kabbalistic text, very early. It was first printed in the 12th century. How long it existed before that, is a matter of some debate. But yeah, early Kabbalistic text, not as old as the Sepher Yetzirah, which we'll also look at today, but early Kabbalistic text before the Zohar. All right, so this the Bahir deals with the Sephiroth. So we'll look at some of the things it says, but not in any kind of complete way. There's a ton of stuff in the Bahir, and there's lots of references to the Sephiroth, so we're not going to be covering this in a kind of complete way. All right, so verse 141, we read, "What are the 10 sayings? The first is the highest crown. Blessed and praised be its name and its people. Who are its people? They are Israel. It is thus written, know that the Lord is God. He made us and not we, his people." And there's kind of a play on words there with Lam and Aleph. So this verse then reads, "To Aleph are we," but don't worry, that's not super important, other than the fact that the Aleph is the first letter and has the value of 1 and is associated with Kether. "It is our duty to recognize and know the unity of unities, who is unified in all his names." I ended up leaving them out today just for reasons of time, but the different names of God are very, very closely associated to the Sephiroth, and that's something we'll come back to later. But just keep in mind that the Sephiroth and the different names for God have a very, very close connection. But I didn't want to overwhelm you with stuff today, any more than I already am. All right, so we'll look at our 32 paths of wisdom. Now, if you saw or were present for the last class series, the paths, letters, and correspondences, we looked at paths 11 through 32. So now we'll look at paths 1 through 10, which correspond with the Sephiroth. All right, so this is the first one here. This corresponds with crown, with Kether. All right, and so Westcott gives the first path is called the admirable or hidden intelligence, the highest crown. For it is the light giving the power of comprehension of that first principle which has no beginning, and is the primal glory, for no created being can attain to its essence. Now, as you've all heard me say, if you were in the last class series, Westcott's translation is much more important for the development of the Golden Dawn tradition. But then I'll also give you Aryeh Kaplan's translation, since it's more scholarly and more closely connected to the Jewish tradition. But Westcott's terminology is often more important for the Golden Dawn tradition specifically. But I think it's helpful to look at both and the differences between them. All right, so Kaplan gives 1, mystical consciousness. This is the light that was originally conceived, and it is the first glory. No creature can attain its excellence. All right, and then this is from 777. In the back in the appendix, Crowley gives a bunch of titles for the different Sephiroth. So those are sort of handy to use here. We've got a big list of stuff here for Kether, and it's not even complete. There's lots and lots of titles that get used for Kether and different names that you'll encounter in your career. But here's some of the most common ones, and the ones that Crowley gives in 777. The small point, the profuse giver, the primordial point, the white head, Amen, lux occulta. Lux occulta, Latin there, literally means hidden light. Mirum occultum. Mirum means something like miracle, or like something that is like awesome. So kind of hidden, awesomeness. I guess that sounds silly in English, but something like that. Inscrutable height, long of nose, long of face, the ancient of days. Now those last 3 are parts of something called the Partsufim, which is mainly from the Zohar, and we'll talk about that in a later class. Since it's a really interesting thing that you will see in the Golden Dawn tradition, but we're not going to deal with it now. Eheye Esher Eheye, existence of existences. Eheye Esher Eheye literally means either I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. This is the name that God gives to Moses when God asks him his name, up on Mount Sinai, when Moses asks him his name. This is the name that God gives here. Eheye Esher Eheye. Which we could translate as existence of existences, or existence is existence, but also I am that I am. All right, ancient of ancient ones, holy ancient one, lux simplicissima, which means something like simplest light. Simplest meaning, like most sort of primitive again, in the sense of like most basic or foundational, without parts, without distinctions, without qualities, just sort of pure light, right? Concealed of the concealed, the head, lux interna, which means like internal light or inner light. The Most High, He. Now that word He is Hu, He, Vau, Aleph. That's a very important divine name. It sums to 12. It's an important name in like Liber Ararita and some other places. All right, and then the head, which is not. One thing you'll see in the Kabbalistic tradition, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the Sepher Yetzirah, is that sometimes Kether is directly kind of associated with the Ein Sof. Sometimes the distinction between like the absolute and Kether is made in slightly different ways. So that's something, especially when you're looking at Jewish material, just to sort of be careful of, that sometimes Kether will be called like the not, or the Ein. Just something to be aware of. All right, our second Sephirah, Chokmah, or wisdom. And that's, you see Chokmah in the big letters there in the center, spelled in Hebrew. Chokmah, means wisdom. All right, so this is verse 142 from the Sepher Bahir. The second one is wisdom. It is thus written, God procured me the beginning of his way before his works from then. A beginning is nothing other than wisdom. As it is written, the beginning is wisdom, the fear of God. Now, this stuff about beginning here, beginning is the first word in Genesis. Is the word Bereshith, which means in the beginning. Bereshith begins with the letter Beth, and the letter Beth is also associated with Chokmah, which is very interesting if you know your Kabbalistic correspondences. Your like tarot correspondences and Yetziratic correspondences. So Beth, is associated with Chokmah, and then also this phrase from Psalms here: "The beginning is wisdom, the fear of God." So Chokmah very much gets associated with the idea of beginning. All right. So second path here. So this is the path for wisdom for Chokmah. Westcott gives the second path is that of the illuminating intelligence. It is the crown of creation. Now, don't get confused there. Crown, obviously, is Kether. You'll see, it's slightly messy kind of terminology like this, especially in the Jewish sources, just something you have to get used to. But we are talking about Chokmah here, not Kether. It is the crown of creation, the splendor of the unity, equaling it, and it is exalted above every head, and named by the Kabbalists the second glory. Kaplan gives 2, radiant consciousness. This is the crown of creation and the radiance of the homogeneous unity that exalts itself above all as the head. The masters of Kabbalah call it the second glory. All right, and then from 777, Crowley gives additional titles of Chokmah. He gives power of Yetzirah. It's also the yod of tetragrammaton. That's the correspondence of the Sephiroth to the tetragrammaton is something we'll deal with in detail later. Also, Abba and Ab, which both mean father. This again is related to the Partsufim, which we'll deal with in a future class. And then Crowley also is noting that it has the divine name Yod-He Vav-He. All right, and then our third Sephirah, Binah, which is translated as understanding. Now, the literal meanings of wisdom and understanding can often be a bit messy. I mean, what the word wisdom means to different people can often be confusing, especially if you start bringing in like Greek words, like gnosis or Sophia. Sometimes like a Greek word that's translated as wisdom and like Chokmah or Binah, they won't always exactly correspond based on like their English translations. So just be careful, especially with wisdom and understanding that, like for instance, the figure of Sophia does not correspond well to Chokmah, even though Sophia is translated as wisdom and Chokmah is translated as wisdom. Just be a little bit careful about your English translations. All right, so this is Binah, understanding. And especially in the Jewish tradition, Chokmah and Binah are very often paired. They're given, in a lot of ways, they're almost the two most important, like the ones that get the most talk and the most discussion, and they're used as like a kind of primordial duality. Very frequently, Chokmah represents like just kind of the unformed, just sort of like raw creation, and then Binah is like the beginning of structure. They can even represent modes of consciousness. So Chokmah can be like formless consciousness, which, like something you could attain in like a meditative state, the consciousness where, you're not like thinking about anything. It's just you're kind of abiding within awareness itself. That's like a Hokmah sort of state. And then Binah is more like the ordinary consciousness of making distinctions between things. So this process happens like in the divine or out of the divine itself, that you go from sort of formless consciousness and now to Binah, to form consciousness, to consciousness that can make distinctions and separations and talk about, form and structure and pattern and all those types of things. All right, so our, I guess I did them out of order. Yeah, I'll just do it, okay. Sepher Bahir first. So this is verse 143. The third one is the quarry of the Torah, the treasury of wisdom, the quarry of the Spirit of God. Now we saw Spirit of God, Ruach Elohim. The P got cut off there in spirit. So Spirit of God can refer to Kether. And then wisdom, of course, there refers to Hokmah. So this is like the treasury of Hokmah. Hokmah, again, as just a kind of force or power. It has no place to be and no like structure. So Binah is also conceived of as like the place where wisdom can begin to take shape. In our tradition, Binah is often figured as like a womb. And so this sort of treasury of wisdom is like the womb in which wisdom can grow. Let's see, and then it goes on. This teaches us that God carved out all the letters of the Torah, engraved it with spirit, and with it made all forms. This is the meaning of the verses. There is no rock like our God. There is no former like our God. All right, and then I'll jump back to the path of wisdom here. All right, so this is for understanding, for Binah, the third path. Westcott gives, the third path is the sanctifying intelligence and is the foundation of primordial wisdom, which is called the creator of faith. And its roots are Amen. That's the word Amen. He's writing it kind of in like transliterated Hebrew, since Amen is Aleph, Mem, Nun. And it is the parent of faith, from which doth faith emanate. And then Kaplan gives 3, sanctified consciousness. This is the foundation of the original wisdom, and it is called faithful faith. It is the root. Its roots are Amen. It is the father of faith, and from its powers, faith emerges. Right, and then Crowley lists some additional titles for Binah, Amma and Ema. Now, this thing about the dark sterile mother and the bright pregnant mother, we'll come back to this. I kind of have a problem with this sort of terminology, but yeah, and we'll deal with this later. And then he also lists 2 of the divine names, Elohim and Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh Elohim, and then finally throne. Which is another important one to be aware of. Sometimes other Sephiroth get called the throne as well, but in our tradition, Binah especially is relevant as the throne. All right, so then between the third and fourth Sephiroth, we have another thing called da'ath, or knowledge. In our tradition, it's sometimes called the false Sephiroth. Now, this can actually be a kind of like illusion or something that almost becomes a bit of like an obstacle or something negative. Now, in the Hebrew tradition, it's not that it's like false, but that it's not fully a Sephirah, but can be kind of treated as one or functions as one. And the Hebrew idea is that knowledge is simply Hokmah and Binah united, or like working together. That through the combined action of Hokmah and Binah is da'ath, or knowledge. So yeah, we don't have any verses for it here, and we may mention it once or twice. We'll look at where it is on the Tree of Life, but we will largely not talk about da'ath, since it's not really a Sephirah. Though again, we'll see it a couple of times. Just know that it comes between the third and fourth Sephirah. All right, so then we have the fourth Sephirah, Hesed. Hesed can be in our tradition, especially, it's usually translated as mercy, but in the Jewish tradition, it's Jewish texts like written in English, it's often translated as kindness, or as love, or as loving kindness, or even as compassion, which I think is nice. Mercy, has a very different sort of connotation to me, anyways, than those other words there. So it's nice to see those other words. Mercy isn't just like, not punishing someone when you could punish them or something like that. But it also includes these ideas of kindness, loving kindness, and of compassion. Its alternate title, so it also has an alternate name that you'll see in some sources, which is Gedula, which is translated as either majesty or greatness. I did these out of order. I guess we'll just start going on in this order. All right, so 32 paths of wisdom for mercy. Westcott gives the fourth path is called the cohesive or receptacular intelligence. It's an awkward word. And is so called because it contains all the holy powers, and from it emanates all the spiritual virtues with the most exalted essences. They emanate one from the other by the powers of the primordial emanation, the highest crown. And Kaplan gives settled consciousness. It is called this because all the spiritual powers emanate from it as the most ethereal of emanations. One emanates from the other through the power of the original emanator. May he be blessed. The original emanator here, of course, is God, the absolute. All right, and then from the Sepher Bahir, we have verse 144. These are three. What is the fourth? Oh, one thing about the Sepher Bahir, it's not really like structured. It's really just kind of like a collection of different like dialogues often between like rabbis and students. Sometimes just it's not always clear who exactly is speaking, and there's like different rabbis that appear in different parts. Yeah, probably a text that was like collected over time, but it's often given in these kind of question and answer. You'll say like, what is the meaning of this verse? And then there'll be the answer. And then sometimes you'll have like a series. It'll be like, what's the meaning of this verse? And then it'll say, what is the meaning of like a particular word in that verse? And then you'll get another answer. It's just the text is often structured this way. So these are three, meaning, the first three Sephra. What is the fourth? The fourth is the charity of God, his merit and his kindness, literally hesed, to all the world. This is the right hand of the Blessed Holy One. All right, and then Crowley didn't give it, well, other than Gedula, Crowley doesn't give any other alternate titles, so we'll just move on to the fifth one. This is Gevurah, strength or power. And so two alternative names. One is Din, which can be translated as justice, judgment, or as rigor. It has the kind of significance of like making distinctions, of like cutting and dividing and distinguishing things from each other. Which there's a lot of nice, if you think about like the judgment card or the adjustment in the tarot, and the image of the magical sword. There's a lot of nice correspondences here with Din. All right, and it's also called Pachad, fear. Now, fear is a very, might seem kind of a little negative or frightening or something like that, but the fear of God is, something that's seen as like a positive quality in the Jewish tradition. And often, if you actually read some of like rabbinic texts and things like that, talking about this idea of the fear of God, it's something more like awe or reverence or something like that than like, acute terror or something. But anyways, another title of Gevurah. All right, path of wisdom here for strength. The fifth, Westcott gives, the fifth path is called the radical intelligence because it resembles the unity, uniting itself to the binah, or intelligence, which emanates from the primordial depths of wisdom or chokmah. 5, rooted consciousness. It is called this because it is the essence of the homogeneous unity. It is unified in the essence of understanding, which emanates from the domain of the original wisdom. All right, I saw someone typing there for a minute. Yeah, feel free to, if people have questions or comments, feel free to jump in as we're going through. Let's see, verse 145, again from Sepher Bahir. What is the fifth? The fifth is the great fire of the Blessed Holy One. Regarding this it is written, let me see the great fire no more, lest I die. This is the left hand of the Blessed Holy One. Let's see. The rest of this isn't super relevant, so let's just skip ahead just for the sake of time. Or actually, let's look at the last paragraph there. It is also written, and as for their height, they had height, and they had fear, and their height was filled with eyes around the four. And around him are angels. Those around them also bow down before them, kneeling and declaring, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. All right, and then this is the sixth Sephra here, Sephiroth, which is usually translated as beauty. It also has the significance of harmony. It also has an alternate name, which I think you'll encounter more in the Jewish tradition than in like the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, which is Rahamim, which also means compassion. And that one, again, is easily to confuse maybe with Chesed, which has some of the same significances. But yeah, this is an alternate title, and you'll see it. I think it's some like Lurianic Kabbalah they often call Sephiroth Rahamim. If you're familiar at all with Islam, you may recognize the word Rahamim. It's at the beginning of when they do Quranic recitation. They all say Bismillah Rahman Rahim, in the name of God, sort of most gracious and either merciful or compassionate. So you can see the related word between the Jewish and, between the Hebrew and Arabic. All right, so from the Sepher Bahir, I did go in different orders. Anyways, it doesn't matter. So Sepher Bahir, we have a whole bunch of verses that talk about the sixth Sepher. The sixth Sepher is quite important and gets a lot of discussion. So we're not going to look at all of it. So we'll look at 146 and part of 147. So 146, the sixth one is the throne of glory, crowned, included, praised, and hailed. It is the house of the world to come, and its place is in wisdom. It is thus written, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And Rabbi Yochanan said, there were two types of light, as it is written, let there be light, and there was light. Regarding both of them, it is written, and God saw the light, that it was good. The Blessed Holy One took one of these types of light and stored it away for the righteous in the world to come. Regarding this, it is written, how great is the good that you have hidden away for those who fear you, that you have accomplished for those who find shelter in you. And this goes on for a while, a lot of discussion about the two different types of light, which isn't super relevant for us here. And then a few verses later, kind of picks back up. And yeah, I think we'll just read just the top, or we'll read a little of this anyways. So 152, you said that the sixth one was his throne. Again, we'll see, we just talked about Binah being associated with the throne, but in the Bahir and in some other Jewish texts, oftentimes the Tifereth is associated with the throne. And remember, this is like the throne is the throne chariot, like from the vision of Ezekiel. And this is what the Merkabah mystics, like ascended to. So yeah, this is the God's throne chariot. He said the sixth was his throne. Have we then not said that it is the crown of the Blessed Holy One? We have said Israel was crowned with three crowns, the crown of the priesthood, the crown of royalty, and the crown of Torah above them all. And let's just sort of skip down to the bottom paragraph there. Sometimes it is called his throne. This is because he carries it as an amulet on his arm, just like a throne. Yeah, we're not going to get into discussion of what the tefillin are, but you can look that up if you're interested in it. All right, our path of wisdom here for beauty. Westcott gives, the sixth path is called the mediating intelligence, because in it are multiplied the influxes of the emanations, for it causes that influence to flow into all the reservoirs of the blessings, with which these themselves are united. And Kaplan gives 6, transcendental influx consciousness. It is called this because through it, the influx of emanation increases itself. It bestows this influx on all blessings, which unify themselves in its essence. All right, and Crowley gives in 777 some additional titles. Lesser Countenance, which is related to the Partsufim that we'll talk about later. Also King, Melech. And then also the Zaire Anpin, another part of the Partsufim. Also Adam, which is a kind of generic title for humanity in the Kabbalistic tradition. Also the Son, the Man, and Spare Angels, which I don't know quite what so it would be interesting to look into what exactly is meant by spare there. Yeah. Oh, just this has nothing to do with the class here, but fun kind of thing about the Hebrew word for king, Melech, it's Mem Lamed Kaf, and so Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King Jr., his initials are MLK, and so MLK rendered as Hebrew would be Mem Lamed Kaf, which literally means king, and obviously his last name is King, and it's an appropriate word for him. I didn't discover that myself. I think Jim Eshelman pointed that out on his forum or something like that at some point. But I always think of that whenever I see Martin Luther King abbreviated as MLK. Anyways, okay. So 7th Sepher here. This is Netzach. Netzach means victory. Generally, it can also mean endurance. And it also kind of has a sense of strength, like a strength that endures to the end. Even like a victory, achieved by long enduring or by long, not necessarily suffering, like in the way that sort of Christians would valorize suffering, but in the sense of just sort of withstanding or enduring trials until victory. All right, so this gets confusing now. In the Sepher Bahir, I almost just erased this entirely so that we didn't have to deal with it. In the Sepher Bahir, it ends up the last 4 Sephiroth are given out of order and are numbered out of order. There's a particular pattern. It's doing that for a particular reason to correspond with a particular pattern that isn't relevant to us. So it's going to refer to Netzach as the 9th and Hod as the 10th, but for us, they're the 7th and the 8th. So just don't get confused by this. We're talking about, it's saying 9th, but we mean 7th. All right, so the 9th and the 10th, which really means 7th, and or in our terminology is 7th and 8th, that's Chokmah, or sorry, this is Netzach and Hod. So Netzach and Hod together are together, one opposite the other. One is higher than the other by 500 years. 500 years is like kind of a symbolic sort of separation between like levels of spirituality or something. I'm not exactly clear on how that works out, but that's the idea, is that one is higher than the other on like in a spiritual sort of level, and so that's symbolized by 500 years. They are like two wheels, one inclined toward the, this is like the wheels of the throne chariot, right? One inclines toward the north while the other inclines toward the west. They reach down to the lowest earth. Let's see, and we'll just skip to the last paragraph there. The victory, which is related to the word Netzach, of the world is there. It is thus written, for victory of victories. Now, in this text, we won't actually have a separate verse for Hod, but Hod is just sort of referred to, Netzach is victory, and then Hod is like the victory of victories. That's just something that happens in the Bahir. They're not in all other Kabbalistic sources. All right, and then for our 32 path of wisdom for victory, Westcott gives, the 7th path is the occult intelligence, because it is the refulgent splendor of all the intellectual virtues which are perceived by the eyes of intellect and by the contemplation of faith. And then Kaplan gives 7, hidden consciousness. It is called this because it is the radiance that illuminates the transcendental powers that are seen with the mind's eye and with the reverie of faith. Now, this term that's translated as occult intelligence or as hidden consciousness is Chokmah Nistara, which is a really interesting Kabbalistic word. We're not going to go into it here, but yeah, that's something worth looking into. That's a very interesting word, very interesting term. All right, and then our 8th Sephirah will be Hod. Hod is usually translated as splendor or glory. All right, so here's our 32 paths of wisdom. The 8th path is called the absolute or perfect intelligence because it is the means of the primordial, which has no roots by which it can cleave nor rest, except in the hidden places of Gedula, right, which we saw as an alternate title for Hesed, the 4th Sephirah, from which it emanates its own proper essence. And then Kaplan gives 8, perfect consciousness. It is called this because it is the original arrangement. There is no root through which it can be pondered, except through the chambers of greatness. Again, greatness is a translation of Gedula, which emanates from the essence of its permanence. All right, yeah, and then as I said, there's no extra text from the Bahir, and Crowley also doesn't give any additional titles for Hod. So we'll move on to the 9th Sephirah, Yesod, foundation. This again is another very important one that's given more focus than some of the others. All right, so the Bahir is going to call it the 8th one, but for us it's the 9th one. So just it's the 9th. Don't worry about why it's being called 8th here. The Blessed Holy One has a single righteous one in his world, and it is dear to him because it supports all the world. It is the foundation. This is what sustains it and makes it grow, increasing and watching it. It is the beloved and dear on high, and beloved and dear below. Fearsome and mighty on high, and fearsome and mighty below. Rectified and accepted on high, and rectified and accepted below. It is the foundation of all souls. Let's see, and now there's some sort of stuff about number that relates to it being the 8th, but that's not relevant to us. So we'll just move on here. Oh, here we go. All right, so path of wisdom. The 9th path is the pure intelligence. So called because it purifies the numerations, right? Numerations there is a translation of Sephiroth. It purifies the numerations. It proves and corrects the designing of their representation and disposes their unity with which they are combined without diminution or division. And then Kaplan gives pure consciousness. It is called this because it purifies the Sephiroth. It tests the decree of their structure and the inner essence of their unity, making it glow. They are then unified without any cutoff or separation. So in traditional Kabbalah, and this works very nicely, I think, in our tradition as well, the second to last Sephirah, Yesod, foundation, receives everything that comes before it. And then from Yesod, you get the final Sephiroth like from that. But it definitely has this idea of taking in all the other qualities that have come before it, purifying them and uniting them, and then finally giving rise to the last Sephirah. All right, but Crowley gives an alternative title here, which is The Righteous is the Foundation of the World. And we just saw some of that talk about righteousness in the passage from the Bahir. All right, 10th and final Sephirah now. We have Malkuth. Now, the translation of Malkuth is an interesting one, and I've been thinking about this. So the Malkuth can equally be translated as kingdom, kingship, and then just sort of a synonym for kingship is sovereignty, essentially. Now, in our tradition, we usually talk about it as the kingdom rather than as kingship. And so, but in a lot of the Jewish texts, they'll talk about it as kingship, as like the quality of kingliness, as a quality of sovereignty. And so I think that the difference between the two terminology, why we tend to think of it as like the kingdom itself, rather than like the abstract quality of ruling over the kingdom, is between these sort of two different levels of the Sephiroth. Because in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, we tend to see what I'm kind of calling like the broader sense of the Sephiroth, which is like the fundamental pattern of everything that exists. So that the Sephiroth map all the way from the divine source down to creation. It makes sense for the lowest level to be essentially the creation itself, which is the kingdom. In the Jewish tradition, where the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, where the Sephiroth are like the emanations of the divinity before the start of the creation, that Malkuth, as the last Sephirah, ends up being the Sephirah, like sort of through which God rules over the creation. So Malkuth is, in the Jewish sense, is like God's kingship or God's sovereignty over creation, and it's largely through Malkuth that God like creates that creates the world, and sort of governs the world. So we can see this, again, like in this sort of more narrow, higher sense. The pattern, going from the Ein Sof, the absolute, infinite, without qualities, through this series of emanations, we've now arrived at the power which can then begin creation and can rule over creation, in the way that, the God who's active and involved with human affairs and which creates the world can now, it can now do that. It can now begin creation. So you can see, in that sense, the Sephiroth as like going from just the pure infinite itself to God as creator. Let's see, just make sure I didn't miss anything here before we go on to the next little group here. I think we're doing okay. All right, so actually, let me let me tell you about Malkuth before we do that. Getting ahead of myself. All right, so the Bahir is going to call Malkuth the 7th, but it's the 10th, so don't worry about that. So it is the heaven of Aravot. Aravot is another name for the Merkava, the throne chariot, and so in some contexts, Malkuth is also associated with the throne chariot, and that's actually something that the Bahir sort of tries to deal with and says, well, if Tefereth is the throne chariot, then Malkuth and Tefereth are the same thing, but then it makes a distinction, on and on. Okay, so why is it called heaven? Because it is round like a head. We learn that it is the center, with water at its right and fire at its left. It supports water from fire and water and brings peace between them. Fire comes and finds the attribute of fire on its side. Water comes and finds the attribute of water on its side. It is therefore written, he makes peace in his high places. So sometimes in the Jewish tradition, the lowest 7 Sephiroth, right? You've got the top 3, the supernal triad of Kether, Hokmah, and Bina, and then the 7 Sephirah below it. Sometimes Malkuth is put kind of at the center of the 7, and then the 6 like surround it as like the 6 directions, above, below, east, west, north, and south. So that's kind of the image we have here of Malkuth as like the center of the lower 7 powers. All right, our paths of wisdom now for Malkuth. Westcott gives The 10th part is the 10th path is the resplendent intelligence, because it is exalted above every head and sits on the throne of Binah. And then Westcott just sort of points out that that's the third path, Binah. This idea of Malkuth being put on the throne of Binah is very important. Crowley makes a lot out of it, and that's something we'll definitely come back to later on. But just useful to know that this is all the way back from the 32 paths of wisdom. We have this idea. It illuminates the splendor of all the lights and causes an influence to emanate from the Prince of the Countenances. Now, Westcott interprets the Prince of the Countenances as Metatron, who is primarily the Archangel of Kether, though he is sometimes associated with Malkuth as well. All right, and then Kaplan gives 10, scintillating consciousness. It is called this because it elevates itself and sits on the throne of understanding. It shines with radiance of all the luminaries, and it bestows an influx of increase to the Prince of the Face. So now Kaplan gives for the Prince of the Countenances or Prince of the Face. Kaplan talks about it as another angel who is particularly important in our tradition, or also as Sandalphon, who does show up in our tradition. Excuse me. Sandalphon, who does show up in our tradition as the Archangel of Malkuth. All right, and then Crowley gives some alternative titles for Malkuth. I had to scan this in two separate groups so that you got like text on the left and then another column on the right there, if that's confusing to look at. All right, so Crowley gives, Malkuth has these titles, among others. The Gate, the Gate also in Chaldean. Now that gate spelled like Tera'ah or sometimes pronounced as Throa, you'll hear like Thelemites saying. That sums to 671, which is also the value of Adonai spelled in full, which is important. And Adonai is a divine name connected to Malkuth. Maybe we'll come back to that later. It's also called the Gates of Death, the Gates of the Shadow of Death, the Gate of Tears, Gate of Justice. And Crowley says gates plural there. You often see it singular too. Gates of Justice, Gates of Prayer, Gate of the Daughter of the Mighty Ones, or the Gate of the Garden of Eden. Also the Inferior Mother, the Daughter, the Queen, the Bride, the Virgin. Now Crowley doesn't list it here, but the Shekinah, who is the God's presence on earth, but specifically conceived of as feminine, is also very much associated with Malkuth. And Malkuth is generally portrayed as feminine. Which is interesting that it's also translated as kingship, that the kingship would be associated with the feminine, which I find interesting. All right, so that was the point I was going to pause and make sure we had covered everything, which I think we have. So let's see, we started about 10 minutes late, so we got about another half hour here. So just real quickly, I want to go through the first chapter of the Sepher Yetzirah. The Sepher Yetzirah, the first chapter will deal with the Sephiroth, though not in a fully systematic way, and as we'll see, it doesn't name them or list them in order. And so it kind of relies on you already having been introduced to them. So that's why I gave it at the end. All right, so verse 1. With 32 mystical paths of wisdom, engraved Yah, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, King of the universe, El Shaddai, merciful and gracious, high and exalted, dwelling in eternity, whose name is holy. He is lofty and holy, and he created his universe with 3 books, with text, with number, and with communication. Now, all these series of titles and names here, if you look up at the Hebrew there, you can see. Let's see. So that word there, that's the word for engraved. So we're engraved Yah. So that's engraved Yah, right? Yod-He. Yod-He, Vav-He, Zavaoth, Lord of hosts, a divine name some of you are probably familiar with. Eloah, Israel, isn't a particularly important one. And then we have Elohim, Chaim, the living God. Associated with Yesod. Whenever God is described as like a living God, some of you like Shaddai El Chai is a name, or just El Chai. Or Elohim Chaim, that Chai, Chaf Yod, is like the root for living. Whenever God is described as like the living God, that almost always has the significance in the Kabbalah of like sexual potency, or like the generative or procreative power. And that's associated with Yesod, and Yesod is associated with the genitals, and the genital center, and the power of, what we call like the generative power, the sex force. And then it goes on from there. So this is a nice, you can sort of dig into these different Hebrew words. And again, as I said, the various divine names associated with the Sephiroth are very important, though these don't correspond like in an order. And there's a lot of different orders given in the early Kabbalistic tradition. We'll come back to it later, but just know that, yeah, the divine names are very, very critical and central to the Sephiroth. But I also want to draw your attention to this last thing. And he created his universe with 3 books. So the books is Sepharim, and that's the word Sepharim right there. And you see that books has the same root, samek pe resh, as Sephirah or Sephiroth. So books, Sepharim, and just Sepher, samek pe resh, can mean book. And also with text, the beth there is just a preposition, but text is Sepher, right? Samek pe resh. And then with number, the vav there means and, but the word here is samek. Hebrew, you get like prefixes and prepositions get like attached to words in Hebrew. And with number, this is sephar, but again is spelled samek pe resh. And then with communication, which is sepher, again the vav just meaning and, but sepher is samek pe vav resh. So again, we see this root of samek pe resh, which we saw as like meaning counting or countings for Sephirah and Sephiroth, is also related to book, text, number, and communication. So these are all kind of additional significances that we can bring into our conception of what the Sephiroth are. They're related to text, number, communication, and books. All right, speeding up here a little. Verse 2. 10 Sephirot of nothingness, and 22 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. All right, so 10 Sephirot of nothingness. In Hebrew, this is Esher. Esher is a Hebrew word meaning 10. So you have Esher, Sephiroth, right? That's Sephiroth, Beli Ma. So the translation of Beli Ma is a little difficult to render in English. Kaplan renders it as like of nothingness. In Westcott's translation, he renders this as ineffable. So Westcott gives 10 ineffable Sephiroth. And so nothingness may have that idea of being like ineffable, that it's nothing in the sense that it's nothing that the human mind can like grasp. In and of themselves, they're beyond anything that human can conceive. But Kaplan also talks about the idea that it may mean like ideal, like not yet actual, that the Sephiroth exist as like potentials, but not, they aren't actualized yet, or like in the beginning, before they're used in the process of creation. All right, and then the 20 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. That was the subject of our last class series on past letters and correspondences. All right, verse 3, 10 Sephirot of nothingness. In the number of 10 fingers, 5 opposite 5, with a singular covenant precisely in the middle, in the circumcision of the tongue and in the circumcision of the membrum. All right, this is sort of a complicated thing. I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's not super important. The Sephiroth get attributed to the 10 fingers. The masculine Sephiroth get attributed to the right hand and the feminine Sephiroth to the left hand. They don't do that in the same way that we do it. And the way they do it is probably not acceptable to most Hebrew Kabbalists since they make Kether masculine. So they kind of divide like things that would be on the pillar of mercy and severity. Those sort of line up the same way that we would do it, but they put they give Kether and Tefereth to male, and then Yesod and Malkuth female. So there's a very clear schema of like the male always being above the female, which isn't part of our system. We see Kether as before the division into gender. But anyways, that's something that happens in the Hebrew Kabbalah that you should be aware of. All right, with a singular covenant precisely in the middle. So this is like in the middle of the 10. So in the circumcision of the tongue and in the circumcision of the membrum. Now the word there that's used for circumcision is, listed in its root is milah. And milah can also mean word. So there's actually kind of a play, there's almost a pun or like a play on meanings here, where normally that would be read in the word of the tongue, and but then the word gets read as circumcision in the circumcision of the membrum. And there's an association between circumcision and like the ability to speak in the Jewish tradition. That's not super important for us, but one pattern we can see here is that you've got like the 10 fingers of the hand, and then sort of in the middle of the hand are like the genitals, and then you also have the 10 toes on the feet, or sorry, in the middle of the hands, because the hands are often raised up in blessing. So in the middle of the 10 fingers, you have the tongue. And then the feet, like the lower body, in the middle of the 10 toes, you have the genitals. So you've got like one inside of 10 and then one inside of 10, which is 22, like the 22 letters. So that's an idea that you can sort of play with. Obviously, circumcision isn't an important thing to us, though it's obviously of critical importance to the Jewish tradition. All right, verse 4 here. 10 Sephiroth of nothingness, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. Understand with wisdom, be wise with understanding. Examine with them and probe from them. Make each thing stand on its essence, and make the Creator sit on his base. All right, so 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. I see this interpreted in different ways. Sometimes people like specifically interpret this as like, oh, Da'ath isn't a Sephiroth because it would be the 11th. But the real thing that's happening here, especially in the way that the Kaplan interprets it, and which sort of matches up everything else I know about the development of like the Hebrew Kabbalah, is that what's being worried about here is the possibility of essentially like a polytheism, that in all of their mysticism and all of these, sort of the parts and attributes of God, is very important that they maintain a monotheism. And so 10 and not 9 means that Kether is a Sephiroth and isn't God. And then 10 and not 11 means that the Ein Sof, the Absolute, is God and not a Sephiroth. So the point is to keep the distinction between like God himself and the Sephiroth distinct, and not allow like God to become one of the Sephiroth or allow one of the Sephiroth to become God. Again, that distinction isn't super important for us, though we may want to have, maintain the idea that there's like a unity or something absolute behind the appearance of multiplicity. But, we don't have the same need to establish monotheism. And actually, I was just reading something in Israel Regardie talking about how in our tradition, the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, we really blend like kind of all the different, we have like sort of polytheism, there's many gods and God forms that we work with, but then there's also the idea of the unity, that everything descends from the one, and then even the idea of like a zero that is before that unity. So you kind of have all levels of, the idea that God is the same as the world, or God is the same as the creation, the idea that God is beyond the creation. You can kind of find all of those ideas within Hermetic Kabbalah. There's no need to like choose one over the other. This phrase about understand with wisdom, be wise with understanding, Kaplan reads this as instructions about meditative practices of alternating back and forth between Hokmah and Binah consciousness, between sort of pure awareness, which is where the Sephiroth can be apprehended, and then like, conceptual understanding and being able to move back and forth between those things. The rest of the verse is interesting, but not incredibly relevant, so we're just going to move on. All right, 10 Sephiroth of nothingness. Their measure is 10, which have no end. A depth of beginning, a depth of end, a depth of good, a depth of evil, a depth of above, a depth of below, a depth of east, a depth of west, a depth of north, a depth of south. The singular master, God, faithful king, dominates over them all, from his holy dwelling until eternity of eternities. So this is something you'll see in the Jewish tradition, not super important in ours, but of attributing the 10 Sephiroth to these 10 kind of like polarities. 6 of them are the polarities of space, 2 of them are the polarities of time, and then you have this kind of spiritual polarity of good and evil. And how exactly those get attributed to the Sephiroth varies a lot among like different Kabbalistic texts. Not super relevant for our tradition, but you may encounter it. But the point is that the God, the singular master, is God. Yeah. All right, verse 6, 10 Sephiroth of nothingness. Their vision is like the appearance of lightning. Their limit has no end. And his word in them is running and returning. They rush to his saying like a whirlwind, and before his throne they prostrate themselves. So this idea about their vision being like the appearance of lightning, it might remind us of the lightning flash, which is something we'll see later on, a particular pattern that gets, or a kind of concept that comes through the Sephiroth. But Kaplan interprets this here as the idea that the Sephiroth can only be glimpsed like as brief, like flashes, like lightning, and that you sort of like have a momentary encounter with them while in Hokmah consciousness, and then sort of return to Binah consciousness back and forth, and you don't try to stay in the like direct awareness of the Sephiroth too long. So it's something that's only sort of glimpsed briefly and then understood later. Yeah, there's some other interesting stuff here. This running and returning is from Ezekiel, which is really interesting. Kaplan interprets it as like a meditative instruction that you sort of, again, alternating back and forth and not getting like trying to stay too long in formless consciousness, but returning to your sort of base state. All right, verse 7, 10 Sephiroth of nothing. Their end is embedded in their beginning, and their beginning in their end, like a flame in a burning coal. For the master is singular, he has no second, and before one, what do you count? All right, so their end embedded in their beginning, and their beginning in their end. End is, or beginning here is usually understood to be kether, even though beginning is often sometimes understood as Hokmah. In this context, beginning and end are like Kether and Malkuth, the first and the last of the Sephiroth. And so the idea is that they're kind of embedded in each other, that Kether, the divine source, is still present within Malkuth, but that in some kind of nascent way, like as a seed or whatever, Malkuth is present within the unity of Kether. And this is said to be like a flame in a burning coal. The idea here, I think, is that like the flame only issues from the coal because it's burning, but the coal is only burning because of the flame, as if, the two things like conditioned each other, as if there was some sort of circle of like self-determination. All right, and then it's just saying that God is singular, he has no second, kind of reinforcing the monotheism stuff. Now this is funny, he says, before one, what do you count? Now a lot of us probably just think, oh, 0. Right, but this is being written before the introduction of 0 to the number system. That doesn't happen until kind of late medieval into Renaissance period. So there is no like number 0. That's true, of course, in the Greek tradition too. There's no number 0. So this is almost like presented as a koan. Like, what do you count before 1? For the people writing this text, there is no answer to that question. Whereas for us, we'll say 0, right? All right, verse 8. 10 Sephiroth of nothingness. Bridle your mouth from speaking and your heart from thinking. And if your heart runs, return to the place. It is therefore written, the chayot, running and returning. Regarding this, a covenant was made. So again, this idea of bridle your mouth from speaking and your heart from thinking, the idea that the Sephiroth can only be apprehended in a kind of non-dual consciousness, that what we can think and say about them isn't actually the essence of them, since they're beyond that. And again, this idea of running and returning is a kind of meditation instruction. The chayot are the living creatures, from the vision of Ezekiel that some of you might be familiar with. Now, this verse was probably, in the original version of the Sepher Yetzirah, it's thought that the Sepher Yetzirah was just these 8 verses, and that everything else was like later commentaries and additions and things that were added to the text. So all of the stuff we saw in the last class of chapters, like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all that stuff was probably added later, as well as verses 9 through 14 here. All right, verse 9, 10 Sephiroth of nothingness. One is the breath of the living God. Blessed and benedicted is the name of the life of worlds, the voice of breath and speech, and this is the holy breath. Now this sort of breath here is Ruach Elohim. So it can mean, Ruach can mean breath, it can mean air, and it can also mean spirit. And what we're referring to here is Kether. Kether is the Ruach Elohim, the breath of the living God. It's also, works well as it's attributed to air in our tradition. Yeah, a lot more we could say, but we need to just keep moving on. 2, breath from breath. With it, he engraved and carved 22 foundation letters, 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals, and 1 breath is from them. Now, this breath from breath, this is Malkuth. Malkuth, being derived from ultimately, from Kether, and that it's Malkuth that's being used to engrave and carve the letters and to start the creation, as we talked about. Again, there's more interesting stuff that we don't have time to get into. All right, 3, water from breath. Now, confusingly, this is actually Hokmah that's being talked about. If any of you know elemental correspondences for the Sephirah, you probably know Hokmah as fire and Binah as water. In the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, that's the other way around. which is a little bit confusing, but also works. I mean, Crowley talks about the idea that the supernals always sort of contain their own opposites. So the idea is that sometimes we see them as fire and water, and sometimes as water and fire. Actually makes perfect sense. So again, although our tradition does it the other way around, I think it's actually worth thinking about them as those attributions flipped. The main idea of water here is of formlessness. All right, so 3, water from breath. With it, he engraved and carved 22 letters from chaos and void, mire and clay. That's actually, I think it says vold there. That's actually a misprint. It should say void. But the idea of chaos and void, tohu vabohu, these ideas are both associated with Chokmah. And if you're familiar with Genesis, you'll know about chaos and void, or void and without form, I think it's often translated as. Yeah, we'll just keep moving on here. The rest of that verse wasn't super important. All right, 4, fire from water. Now this is talking about Binah. With it he engraved and carved the throne of glory, seraphim, Ophanim, and holy Kayot, and ministering angels. From these 3 he founded his dwelling, as it is written, he makes his angels of breaths, his ministers of flaming fire. We won't worry about the specifics here, but just the idea that from Binah is being created the other powers, like the seraphim, Ophanim, holy Kayot. These are like orders of angels. All right, and then I skipped verse 13 because it's not super relevant. It's kind of a digression and not super relevant for what we're talking about here. But I'll just give you, this is the last verse in chapter 1 of Sepher Yetzirah. These are the 10 Sephiroth of nothingness. The breath of the living God, Kether, breath from breath, Malkuth, water from breath, Binah, water from breath, Chokmah, fire from water, Binah, up, down, east, west, north, south. The up, down, east, west, north, south thing refers back to the previous verse that we skipped over. But again, just that idea of the Sephiroth, like defining the 6 directions. So actually you do have all 10 Sephiroth here. So you've got, so we saw like breath from the living God, water from breath, and fire from water. That's the supernal triad, the first 3. And then up, down, east, west, north, south. That's like the middle 6. And then breath from breath, that's Malkuth, the 10th. Okay, so that's been a really short, just sort of overview of stuff. Let's see, starting to come to the end here, but we still got a few minutes. We started a little late, so I'll go a few minutes past. So just returning to our full list here, again in English. I think it's easy. This is something that's definitely happened to me over the years, is that I've come to just think of like the Hebrew names as sort of like technical terms. Like Kether means the one at the top. Chokmah means like the one beneath that. Binah means the one after that. Tefereth is the one in the middle. Malkuth is the one at the bottom. And I don't think about what those words actually mean, that this is crown, wisdom, understanding, kingdom. And I think being reminded of what these words actually mean can be can be kind of refreshing in a way. I've found to think about them again, instead of thinking of Kether as just like a name for the first one. Think about it as a crown. Think about Chokmah as wisdom. Think about Tefereth as beauty. Think about Malkuth as the kingdom or as kingship. Yesod as the foundation. So yeah, lots of different patterns. Later on, we'll see the tree of life, which is our most important way of patterning these things. We've already seen the pattern a little bit. One we'll see a lot is you have the initial triad of crown, wisdom, understanding. This is what gets called the supernal triad. Those 3 get a lot of emphasis. And then the middle 6 of mercy through foundation are often grouped together and are given less importance. Of those, beauty, Tefereth, is often given the most importance as the kind of central one. And then foundation, Yesod, is often given importance too, like we said, as receiving everything that comes from above it. And then Malkuth gets lots of importance. So there's really emphasis on like the first 3 and then the final one. And then the middle 6 are often kind of grouped together and given less they're often seen more as like attributes or qualities and less as like ontological kind of states of creation and things like that. So they have a little bit less of a philosophical significance and more of just a significance as these different like qualities and powers. Though again, there's not really a hard line between that, but just know that there's not always an even balance. And very different from like the 22 letters. Now the 22 letters can be arranged on the tree, and so that gives you a kind of hierarchy of like top down, but the letters really are just a kind of like alphabet. They can be scrambled and rearranged and all that sort of stuff. And at least in one sense, the letters are all kind of on the same plane. You know, you have like elements, planets, zodiac, you know, all the basic kind of elements that get used in all Kabbalistic texts. But the Sephiroth are very much not just hierarchical, but are like really an account of creation, and are something, I don't know, somewhere between like philosophy and theology, that really talks about how the divine moves into manifestation, and how the divine interacts with the creation and with the world, and how we can in turn like interact with it. And so used as a meditational pattern, you know, the idea is that you can actually access sort of the higher states of consciousness by meditating on these things, and that they're like a ladder, and that we can ascend this ladder or descend it, you know, to affect the powers of creation, or ascend it for like a mystical journey, you know, back to the source. But it definitely has like a philosophical and theological significance and importance that the letters didn't have. And I think that's why the letters are a complete set in their own right. So this is something a little bit different than just a set of symbols. This is also a set of, like a kind of concepts and a like philosophical, theological understanding of the nature of creation and the nature of divinity. All right, so yeah, just in the last couple minutes here, I wanted to mention really quickly something that you'll probably see, and that has kind of occasionally some of these ideas like make their way into Hermetic Kabbalah, but they're often kind of on the periphery or on the boundary. And these are ideas that are most especially taken from like Lurianic Kabbalah. And so I'm not going to get bogged down in the history, but in the kind of history of the way that the Christian Kabbalah and then Hermetic Kabbalah develops, it splits off from the Kabbalistic tradition before Isaac Luria. So Luria's like Kabbalistic teachings aren't always included, though there's been people who have like accessed Luria, and sometimes the distinction between like Lurianic and non-Lurianic Kabbalah isn't fully made. And Luria himself is like interpreting. Luria is interpreting earlier Kabbalistic texts. So the roots of like Lurianic concepts are found in earlier things, though Luria gives like particular interpretations of them. And so two of these ideas from Luria, which again have their roots in earlier Kabbalistic texts, but really get like brought out and developed by him in the later Safed school, is the idea of the Zimzum. The first one is of Zimzum, or contraction. And this is the idea that the infinite, you know, the Ein Sof, or the Ein Sof Or, like the light of the infinite, that because it is infinite in all possible ways, and it absolutely fills and saturates everything to like an infinite level. So there's no like space or room in which the creation could happen. So that before the creation can start, there has to be like an empty space sort of cleared within the Godhead for the creation to take place. And so this is the idea of the contraction, or the Zimzum. And it's actually represented in this diagram as the vertical like white line that extends down from the infinite down into the kingdom. The idea is that like the outer white space, actually let me go flip way back to the full diagram. I think that'll be a little easier to look at. Okay, here we go. Right, so the outer white space, that's like the space that's either the infinite itself, or like the space. I mean, you could see the first like outer black circle as like the space that's cleared. Yeah, but then the idea that the light, all that light that's contracted to make the empty space, it's contracted down to just this like narrow band of light that extends, you know, from the infinite all the way down to the kingdom. So as we'll talk about this a little bit next week, one thing that makes the Sephiroth a little bit different than like Neoplatonic emanations is that they're all still connected to the infinite. It's not just Kether the crown that's connected to the infinite, they all still are. And so that's kind of represented in this diagram as this like band of white light, which is the infinite light that used to sort of fill everything and saturate everything, but had been contracted down to this band within the space. Outside of that space, you still have the infinite light, but within like the space where creation happens. It's just contracted to this band of light. So that idea of contraction, that's the Zimzum. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about Zimzum that we don't have time to get into here. And then the second idea that you'll see from Lurianic Kabbalah is the idea of the Shevirah, the Shevirat HaKelim, which means like the shattering of the vessels. And this is the idea that when the divine light first fills the Sephiroth, like first descends through the 10 Sephiroth, it overwhelms them and they shatter. And their pieces like fall down to the lowest level of creation. And so after this catastrophe, that sort of explains why the world is imperfect, why there's evil in the world. It's because the vessels are all broken. And so Luria's idea is that Kabbalists, and even sort of Jews in general, by following the commandments and studying Torah and especially studying like the deep wisdom of the Kabbalah, they enact this process that the tikkun ha'olam, which is like the restoration of the world or the healing of the world. And then some very complex things which happen where, so the Sephiroth are sort of shattered, and now the Kabbalists have like sort of rebuild it and reconstruct it. But there's some very sort of complex things that happen where they don't really exist until they're rebuilt. And you even get sort of weird kind of ideas where in the tikkun, like Kabbalists or people studying Torah are like creating God, even though humans in the world are created by God. So it gets very, very abstract. But you will see these ideas of the Zimzum, of the contraction, and also the idea of the Shevirah, the shattering of the vessels, and the tikkun. Again, they're kind of like on the margins of being part of our tradition, but you will see them at times. And if you read like Kaplan or any kind of later Jewish commentaries, almost all of them are coming out of like, are descendants of like Luria's school. So in all like kind of contemporary Jewish Kabbalah, these ideas are almost always present. So important to notice, and I think interesting too, maybe this is a lecture for another time, but I think there's actually very nice parallels between certain like thelemic concepts, like, Nuit in chapter 1, talking about like, I am divided for love's sake. I think the division there, and the idea that division happens in order for reunification, I think that is in a lot of ways can be related to, like ideas of the Zimzum and then this double process of the Shevirah and the tikkun. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really nice work that could be done there from a thelemic perspective, and of kind of doing like a syncretic, sort of work between Thelema and the Lurianic Kabbalah. But yeah, that's a topic for another time. All right, actually, let me pause here. Everyone just wants to bear with me for just a few more minutes here. Sorry, a couple comments come in while I was talking. Let's see. Christopher was commenting that he's not used to looking at the Sephiroth in that form. Good. That's one of the reasons I wanted to show you this. Was I wanted to, people who are a little bit more experienced with this, I wanted to kind of shake you up and make you think about things in a little bit of a different way that you're not used to seeing them. So I'm glad that had its intended effect. He said, it seems to have an implication of existence inside existence. 10 lives in one, etc. It creates some good imagery inside my head. Yeah, that's great. Kristen comments that the image is intense. It makes me think it will cause visual hallucinations if looked at for too long. Yeah, right. The concentric bands of black and white. I have those like optical effects, which are kind of cool. I like optical effects like that. Oh yes, and thanks, Baz spelled Zimzum. Thank you for that. Okay, yeah. So that was real quick, and I hopefully refrained from saying too much about, Kether is like this, Hokmah is like this. Let sort of the texts speak for themselves. But what I want to suggest is that you undertake like some meditations on these things. And actually for all the classes, I've designed some practices that can go with it. I mean, these are just sort of optional things. You're not turning anything into me or anything like that. So feel free to, to do it as you will. But I'm kind of building it into the class, or the future classes will presume that you've done this. So for the next 2 weeks, we'll meet again 2 weeks from today. So in the next 2 weeks, I would suggest that you do a few things. Memorize the names of the 10 Sephiroth, just the main names. Don't worry about alternative titles or alternative names or anything like that. So memorize the name in English, right? Like crown, understanding, or crown, wisdom, understanding. You probably, yeah. In places where there's more than one English name, you can just sort of choose one. The most common one might be helpful, but yeah. So memorize the English names, the Hebrew names, like, Kether, spelled Kether, right? Or that's transliteration. And then also, the Hebrew itself, Kaf, Tav, Resh for Kether, as well as the numbers. So, knowing which one's number 1, which one's number 6, which one's number 4. Getting all that stuff down is really important. If you are absolutely brand new to this, and that seems a little overwhelming, I would say don't worry about the actual Hebrew spellings. Just get the English name, like crown, and then the transliterated Hebrew. So Kether, Kether. If you don't know how to spell it in Hebrew characters yet, that's fine. Don't overwhelm yourself, but that would be my suggestion. And then, especially for people who already have these things memorized, you could meditate on the names in English, both individually and in sequence. And by that I mean, you could just do like a single kind of meditation of thinking about the idea of like the crown, and then another meditation thinking about wisdom, another meditation thinking about understanding, and then also meditations where you go through the full sequence. And I suggest you go through the sequence both, from 1 to 10, and then also going 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Do the meditations both forward and backwards. Now, if you are advanced, like if you've been studying this for a few years or something like that, another thing you could do would be to investigate the Hebrew names of the Sephiroth, add up their values, look up those values in 777, or find other ways of looking at those numbers, and also look at them by correspondences, like break down the correspondences of the individual letters, right? Like Kether is Kaf, Tav, Resh, right? And so Kaf, that corresponds with, with Jupiter, Tav corresponds with Saturn, Resh with the sun, and all the other correspondences like that we went through in our last correspondence class. And so you could try to analyze the names of the Sephiroth in terms of their correspondences, or even look at them, as the tarot cards. Like for Kether, you could lay out, fortune corresponding with Keth, the universe corresponding with Tav, and then the sun corresponding with Resh, and like kind of lay out those 3 cards, from right to left, and then meditate, on those 3. So there's lots of kind of more advanced meditations that you could do. If those simple ones seem too simple. Though again, I think kind of going back to meditating on just the simple meaning of like victory, beauty, I think that's really helpful, even for people who have gone more advanced, to just be reminded of like the simple meanings of those names, and to also think about our personal associations to those things. When you think of beauty, what do you think of? What does beauty remind you of? When in your life have you experienced beauty, or the most profound beauty? Where do you find beauty? Things like that. Getting like kind of personal associations with these things is also really helpful. So yeah, I think that a lot of what I didn't say can kind of be filled in by your own practice of meditation and reflection on these things. And then I also said you can design other meditations on the Sephiroth. So yeah, look at other ways of meditating on them. But the basic thing I wanted you to do is just to start. If you're not memorizing them, you just get the basic ideas memorized. I'll kind of assume that in the classes going forward. But whether you already have them memorized or not, just kind of doing some meditations on those basic meanings and letting them kind of sink in and really become sort of part of your consciousness, and start building up these reservoirs of association with all of those. Okay, so yeah, that'll do it for today. For more info about our work, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. There's my email address if you want to contact me personally or be added to the public Google group. And for anyone who's not a member of either the academic or the initiatory track, we do have a $5 suggested donation, which you can send to PayPal or send to us via PayPal at payments@tots.org. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes. Yeah, thanks everybody. So again, that was pretty basic, although we did go through a lot of material. And then in the coming weeks, we'll just sort of build more and more on this foundation. I didn't give too much of an overview of what we'll be doing going forward, and that was partially intentional, but I'll just give you a preview of what we'll look at next week. Next week, we'll look at like kind of Pythagorean ideas and Neoplatonic ideas, which help form some of the basic sort of concepts and philosophy that underlie the Sephiroth. And we'll look a lot at the numbers. We'll look at the numbers 1 through 10. Today we were just sort of, I don't know if I really made the point earlier, but today we were just sort of looking at the numbers as like an ordering, right? So two doesn't mean like the two or the dyad, like the concept of two-ness. Two is just the one that comes after the first one. And then three is just the one that comes after the one that comes after the first one, right? It's just about putting them in a sequence. But next week, we'll actually talk about some of the philosophical and especially kind of Greek philosophical ideas associated with the numbers. Yeah, so thanks everybody. I don't see any comments coming in, so I'll shut off the recording.